For decades, Audrey Hepburn was Hollywood's most graceful mystery. The world watched her fall in love on screen 100 times, but behind closed doors, she was haunted by one man she could never forget. In her final years, when Audrey knew her time was running out, she did something she'd never done before. She named him. She told the people closest to her exactly who had broken her heart in a way no one else ever could. And the man she named wasn't her husband. It wasn't a co-star. It was someone from her past that almost no one knew about. Someone who shaped every relationship she'd ever have and every role she'd ever play. Most people think they know Audrey Hepburn's love story. They know about Mel Ferrer, her first husband. They know about Andrea Ditti, her second. They've read about her romances with co-stars and her decades-long partnership with Robert Wolders. But none of those men were the one. None of them were him. His name was James Hansen, and he wasn't famous. He wasn't in the movies. He was a British financier and businessman, the kind of man most Hollywood insiders would have forgotten by Tuesday. But Audrey never forgot him. Not for a single day in 50 years. They met in the 1950s when Audrey was already becoming a star. She was young, talented, and the world was falling at her feet. But when she met James Hansen, something shifted. According to those who knew her during this time, Audrey fell completely. Not the performative Hollywood kind of love, the real kind. The kind that changes the shape of your chest when you think about it. Here's where the story gets complicated. James Hansen wanted to marry her. He wanted a real life, not red carpets and premieres, but a home, children, normalcy. Audrey wanted those things too, but there was a problem neither of them could solve. At that exact moment in time, Audrey's career was exploding in ways that couldn't be stopped or delayed. She was being offered roles that came once in a lifetime. Roman Holiday, Breakfast at Tiffany's, Sabrina. These weren't just movies. They were destiny calling. So they made a choice. The kind of choice that sounds romantic in theory but destroys you in practice. They chose differently. Audrey chose her career. James chose a life without waiting. He married someone else, a woman named Brownin, and they built a life together far away from the spotlight. But here's what nobody talks about. Audrey never actually moved on. She fell in love again, yes. She married twice. She had children. She built a beautiful life. But according to everyone close to her, there was always a ghost in the room. A what if? A person she wondered about. The real mystery isn't whether she loved him. The mystery is what made her finally speak his name and what she said when she did. To understand why James Hansen mattered so much, you have to understand who Audrey was in 1952. She wasn't yet a household name. She was 22 years old, Dutch-born, with a childhood scarred by World War II. She'd lived through Nazi occupation. She'd seen people suffer in ways most Americans couldn't imagine. That kind of trauma doesn't just disappear. It lives in you. It makes you need things other people don't need: safety, normalcy, someone who sees you and doesn't look away. James Hansen offered her that. He was older, established, grounded. He came from old money and older values. He wasn't interested in the chaos of Hollywood. He wanted to build something real with Audrey. And for the first time since the war, Audrey believed she could have that kind of life. But the timing was impossibly cruel. Colette, the author of the novel Gigi, had specifically requested Audrey for a film adaptation. This wasn't just any offer. This was an author, a legend, saying, "I see you. You're the one." That kind of validation doesn't come twice. Audrey's agent knew it. Hollywood knew it. And most importantly, Audrey knew it. There's a photo from 1953 that captures the exact moment everything changed. Audrey is at a formal event, James beside her. She's smiling, but her eyes are somewhere else entirely. It's the face of someone who already knows she's making a decision that will cost her something irreplaceable. The split wasn't dramatic or public. It was quiet and civilized, the kind of breakup that looks mature from the outside but feels like drowning from the inside. James married Brownin in 1955. Audrey threw herself into work. She won an Academy Award for Roman Holiday. She became an icon. She had everything, except him. What makes this story so brutal is that James Hansen lived a full life. He was happy. He had children. He built a successful business empire. By every measure, he made the right choice for himself. But Audrey spent the next decades wondering what her life would have looked like if she'd chosen differently. If she'd said no to the cameras and yes to the quiet life. If she'd picked love over legacy. And here's the thing that kept her up at night. She couldn't even be angry about it. She was the one who chose her career. She was the one who said goodbye. So, all that longing, all that regret, it had nowhere to go. It just sat inside her, waiting. Her subsequent marriages weren't failures, but they were in some ways attempts to recreate what she'd felt with James Hansen. That sense of being truly seen, that feeling of safety, that promise of a simple life. None of them quite delivered it the same way. After James Hansen, Audrey married Mel Ferrer in 1954, while she was still processing the loss of James. Mel was a talented actor and director, charming and sophisticated. On paper, it looked perfect. In reality, it was a marriage built on rebound and compromise. Audrey had a son with Mel, Luca, and by most accounts, she loved being a mother. But the marriage itself was troubled from the start. There were whispers about Mel's controlling nature, about how he tried to shape Audrey's career decisions, about the fundamental incompatibility between what they each wanted. Friends from that era have said Audrey seemed to be searching for something she couldn't name. She'd throw herself into motherhood, then into charity work, then into another film role, never quite settling, never quite at peace. It was as if she was running from the ghost of James Hansen, trying to outrun the life she didn't choose. The marriage lasted 13 years. When it ended, Audrey didn't immediately jump into another relationship. She spent time alone. She raised her children. She became involved in humanitarian work, UNICEF, relief efforts, causes that had nothing to do with fame or recognition. Those who worked with her during this period described a woman who was finally finding peace, not through love, but through purpose. But then she met Andrea Didi in 1968. He was a psychiatrist, intelligent, kind, from a respected Italian family. On the surface, Andrea represented something Audrey desperately wanted. Stability, intellectual engagement, a partner who seemed to understand her psychological needs. They married, and for a while, it seemed like maybe this time would be different. It wasn't. The marriage lasted 14 years. And while it produced her second son, Luca's younger brother Robin, it ultimately followed the same pattern. Audrey remained somewhat distant, somewhat searching. She was a devoted mother and a gracious wife, but there was always a part of her that seemed unreachable, a part that belonged to someone else. What's remarkable is that Audrey never became bitter about any of this. She didn't spiral into anger or resentment. Instead, she seemed to accept it as the price of her choices. She'd picked her career over James Hansen, and she'd lived with the consequences. It wasn't tragedy in the classical sense. It was something quieter and more devastating. The slow realization that some doors, once closed, never open again. In her later years, after her second marriage ended, Audrey found genuine peace with Robert Wolders, a former actor who became her companion for the final 2 decades of her life. By all accounts, this relationship was different. Not passionate or all-consuming, but warm, comfortable, and real. Robert didn't try to change her or complete her. He simply loved her as she was, a woman with a beautiful life and an old sorrow she'd learned to carry. And yet, even with Robert, even with decades of distance and marriage and children and achievement, Audrey still thought about James Hansen. Here's what most biographies miss. Every character Audrey Hepburn played was, in some way, a reflection of her own internal conflict. The women she chose to portray were almost always searching for something. They were caught between duty and desire, between the life they wanted and the life they were supposed to live. In Breakfast at Tiffany's, she played Holly Golightly, a woman running from her past, reinventing herself, unable to commit to anyone or anything. In Sabrina, she was caught between 2 brothers, trying to figure out which version of love was real. In Two for the Road, she explored a marriage that was loving but complicated, built on compromises and unspoken longings. In My Fair Lady, she played Eliza Doolittle, a woman transformed by circumstance and ambition, forever changed by forces outside her control. These weren't random choices. Audrey was drawn to these stories because they echoed her own story. She was telling her truth through fiction night after night, year after year. The roles were her way of processing the decision she'd made at 22 years old. What makes this even more poignant is that Audrey was fully aware of what she was doing. She was an intelligent, introspective woman who understood psychology and symbolism. She knew that her art was her autobiography, and she seemed to accept that this was the trade-off. She got to be immortal on screen, but she had to be somewhat untethered in real life. She got to explore every version of love through her characters, but she couldn't fully experience it herself. People who worked with Audrey during her peak years described her as kind but distant, professional but guarded. She had close friends, but she kept part of herself hidden. She was a mother and a wife, but there was always something held back. Not coldly, but carefully, as if she'd learned early that the people closest to you could leave, that love could require impossible choices, and that sometimes the safest thing was to not depend entirely on anyone. The irony is crushing. Audrey Hepburn became the most beloved actress of her generation by playing women searching for love and meaning. But in her personal life, she was searching too. She was searching for what she'd given up when she chose her career over James Hansen. She was searching for proof that the trade-off had been worth it. And the answer was complicated. Yes, she'd achieved incredible things. Yes, she'd brought beauty and grace to the screen in ways that still move people today. Yes, she'd had children and built a life that mattered. But there was always that question underneath. Everything. What if she'd chosen differently? What would that life have looked like? Would it have been better? Would she have been happier? These weren't idle thoughts. They were the organizing principle of her entire emotional life. For half a century, Audrey kept this to herself. She didn't talk about James Hansen in interviews. She didn't mention him in the few autobiographical pieces she allowed to be published. She didn't confide in most of her friends. It was her private heartbreak, her private ghost, her private what if. But people close to her knew. Her son Luca knew. Her close friends knew. Robert Wolders knew. They could see it in the way her expression would change if his name came up. They could sense it in the conversations she'd have late at night when she was reflective and vulnerable. They understood that Audrey was carrying something that never quite healed. What's particularly striking is that James Hansen lived a completely separate life from Audrey's. He never sought attention. He never tried to capitalize on their past relationship. He never even acknowledged publicly that they'd been serious. He married Brownin, built his business, raised his family, and lived quietly away from the spotlight. By most accounts, he was a good man who made his own peace with the road not taken. But Audrey couldn't quite do that. Maybe it was her nature. Maybe it was the nature of her fame, being constantly watched, constantly analyzed, constantly asked about her romantic life. Maybe it was simply that she'd sacrificed more than he had. He'd moved on because he had to. She'd stayed behind because the cost of moving on was admitting that her choice had been the wrong one. So she carried it, through her marriages, through her affairs, through her humanitarian work, through her aging. She carried the weight of James Hansen like a stone in her pocket, not heavy enough to cripple her, not obvious enough for most people to notice, but always there, always present. There are interviews from the 1970s and 1980s where you can see traces of this. When asked about love, Audrey would give measured, careful answers. She'd talk about the importance of partnership and compromise. She'd speak about how marriage required sacrifice. She'd describe love as something more complex than passion, something quieter, more grounded. These weren't abstract philosophies. These were lessons learned from a specific heartbreak. And then, in the 1980s, something shifted. Audrey began to open up slightly. She started doing more interviews about her personal life. She became more philosophical about her choices. She seemed, finally, to be making peace with her past. Not forgetting it, but accepting it, understanding that the life she'd chosen, while different from the one she might have had with James Hansen, had been a good life. A meaningful life. A life that mattered. But acceptance and resolution aren't the same thing. And as Audrey entered her 60s and 70s, as her health began to decline, as mortality became real and immediate, something changed again. The old longing resurfaced, not with the intensity it had when she was young, but with a different kind of urgency. The urgency of someone who knows she's running out of time. In 1992, Audrey Hepburn was diagnosed with abdominal cancer. She was 63 years old. The diagnosis came as a shock, but Audrey faced it with the same grace and composure she'd brought to everything else in her life. She continued working on humanitarian projects. She spent time with her family. She prepared in her own quiet way for the end. During this final period, Audrey became more reflective than ever before. She began to have conversations with the people closest to her about her life, her choices, her regrets. These weren't dramatic deathbed confessions. They were quiet talks, the kind that happen in hospitals and living rooms when time is running short and pretense no longer matters. And during these conversations, Audrey did something she'd never done before. She named James Hansen. She talked about him openly. She told her sons about the man she'd loved before they were born. She told Robert Wolders about the road not taken. She told close friends about the choice she'd made at 22 and how it had shaped everything that came after. According to those who were present, Audrey didn't express regret exactly. She wasn't saying, "I wish I'd chosen differently." Instead, she was finally acknowledging the cost of her choice. She was saying, "This is what I gave up. This is the price I paid for the life I lived, and I need you to understand that it was real. He was real. That love was real." It was, in a way, a final act of honesty. Audrey had spent her entire life performing on screen and, to some degree, in her personal relationships. She'd kept parts of herself hidden. She'd managed her image carefully. But at the end, when the performance no longer mattered, she let people see the full truth. She let them see the woman behind the icon, the woman who had loved James Hansen, the woman who had chosen her career instead, the woman who had lived with that choice every single day of her life. What she told them mattered because it reframed everything. All those beautiful films, all that grace and elegance, it wasn't coming from a place of perfection or certainty. It was coming from a place of longing. The beauty on screen was partly a reflection of beauty in her soul, but it was also a reflection of sorrow. The roles she played were partly expressions of who she was, but they were also expressions of who she wished she could be. The woman she might have become if she'd chosen James Hansen instead of Roman Holiday. Her family didn't see this as weakness. They saw it as truth. And in those final months, as Audrey's health deteriorated, they held that truth with her. They acknowledged that the great Audrey Hepburn, the icon, the legend, the woman who'd brought grace to Hollywood, was also a woman who had loved and lost, who had sacrificed and compromised, who had carried an old heartbreak through every stage of her life. Robert Wolders later spoke about how important it was to Audrey that people understood this, not to diminish her achievements, but to contextualize them, to show that perfection on screen could coexist with imperfection and longing in real life, to prove that you could live a meaningful life while still wondering about the roads you didn't take. Audrey Hepburn died on January 20th, 1993. She was 63 years old. At her funeral, the people who loved her gathered to remember not just the actress, but the woman. And James Hansen's name was spoken, not as a scandal or a secret, but as part of her story, as part of who she was. In the years since her death, biographers and documentarians have tried to understand Audrey's life more completely. And James Hansen has become an important piece of that puzzle. Not because their relationship was scandalous, it wasn't. Not because it was particularly long or dramatic by Hollywood standards, but because it was real, because it mattered, because it shaped everything that came after. What Audrey's willingness to name him at the end tells us is something profound about how we live our lives. We make choices big life-altering choices based on the information and circumstances we have at 22 or 30 or 40. We choose our careers or our relationships, our ambitions or our families, our public lives or our private ones. And then we live with those choices. We build meaning around them. We construct narratives to make sense of them. But underneath it all, there's often a ghost. A what if? A person or a path we didn't choose. Audrey's story says that acknowledging that ghost doesn't diminish your life. It doesn't make your achievements less real or your relationships less valuable. It just makes you human. It makes you honest. It says that even the most graceful, most accomplished, most seemingly perfect people among us are carrying unresolved longings. That even the greatest love stories have untold chapters. That even the most beautiful lives have shadows. The reason James Hansen's name matters today is because Audrey gave it permission to matter. By speaking his name at the end of her life, by acknowledging what she'd felt for him, she was saying something important to everyone listening. Your heartbreaks are real. Your sacrifices are real. The roads you didn't take matter. And you don't have to pretend they don't. For decades, people have watched Audrey Hepburn on screen and felt transported by her grace. They've watched her play women searching for love and meaning, and they've believed in those characters completely. Now, knowing about James Hansen, those performances take on a new dimension. Now, we understand that when Audrey played a woman torn between duty and desire, between ambition and love, between the life she wanted and the life she was supposed to live, she wasn't acting. She was remembering. James Hansen died in 1987, 6 years before Audrey. He never knew that she'd spent 50 years thinking about him. He never knew that his name would outlive them both, woven into the fabric of her legacy. He lived his life, built his family, made his peace, but Audrey carried him with her until the very end. And that's the real story. Not a tragedy, not a scandal, but a testament to the power of love to shape us, to haunt us, to define us, even when we choose something else, even when we build beautiful, meaningful lives in other directions. James Hansen was the man Audrey Hepburn never got over. And by naming him at the end, she gave us all permission to acknowledge our own ghosts, to admit that some people change us in ways that never quite fade, to understand that the most graceful lives are often the ones carrying the deepest longings. In the end, Audrey Hepburn didn't choose between James Hansen and her career. She lived both choices simultaneously. She built a legendary life while carrying an old love like a secret. And when she finally spoke his name, she wasn't admitting failure. She was admitting humanity. She was saying, I was real. My longing was real. My sacrifice was real. And it all mattered.